Good morning, everybody. We will just get started in just a moment. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're going to be talking today about the power of personas and user experience journey maps. So I'm really excited that we can talk to you about this topic today, and I'm sure that you're going to find the session really insightful. So for those of you who don't know about Hart, we are a technology consultancy and we work only in the non-profit sector. We treat all clients and partners equitably, regardless of size or scale, so we always maintain our independence. So before we get started properly, a little bit of a webinar etiquette. So this session today will be recorded. Please do use the Q&A box for any questions that you have for Mike or my colleague or myself. Send them in at any time during the presentation and we will address them a little bit later on. We're really keen for it to be as interactive as possible and make sure that we are addressing any questions or issues or even anything that you want to share with us. So please do be involved. And finally, the chat box. If you've got any technical or general questions, pop them in the chat box and I'll come back to you during the session as well. And just to answer one of the most common questions we probably get is that we will circulate the slides following the session and we'll also circulate the on-demand recording so that you can watch it again or share with your colleagues. So today, I'm Rebecca and I'm Programme Delivery Manager here at Hart and I'm really delighted to be hosting this webinar with my colleague Michael. So Michael, could you give a quick intro?
Good morning everyone, I'm Michael Wilcox and I'm a business change consultant at Hart.
Perfect, thank you Michael, and we're going to be hearing a lot more from Michael as we go through today's session, so really pleased that he's able to join us today. So before we move into the slides, we're really interested to just run a short poll, and this poll is to find out kind of what stage you are at in kind of understanding around personas and user experience journey mapping. So we want to kind of know whether you're seeking more information, maybe you've got some insight, but you're just not sure where to start. Are you actually currently working through this information activity even, so the personas and user journey mapping, or have you done this, but you're actually considering what to do with everything next? So bear with me while I bring up this poll, which should be coming up shortly on your screens. And let's just give that a couple of seconds for people to fill in. And it'll be really interesting to see sort of where you are actually on the journey of really this kind of activity or project so that we can kind of try and help you through today's session as well. So I'll just give this another couple of moments and then I'll share the results. Perfect. Let me end the poll and share results. So here we go. So it's actually quite evenly spread in a way between that sort of seeking information, almost not sure where to start, currently developing. So, and also we've got a couple of people who are also kind of, they've done it, but they are looking at next steps. So certainly, as we go through today's session, we will bear that in mind and make sure that we try and answer and look at where you are in your journey. So thank you for that. Okay, so the aim of today's session is to kind of give you the tools, the information and the insights to better understand how users interact with your products and services and what you can do to further enhance that user experience, which might be through engagement, might be through efficiencies. We all know that, it's quite easy, to find the quantity in terms of, who visits your website, but actually, do you know how they felt about that journey? Did they have any frustrations or pain points along the way? We all know from our own personal experiences that a poor customer experience online can either mean the end of that transaction or what you're trying to do, or it just does cause you that frustration. So we're going to look at a couple of approaches where it might help you identify the issues, remove the points of frustration, or actually make sure that you don't create them in the first place. And by looking at personas and user journey mappings and looking at how they can help improve your organisation, streamline services, we're kind of hoping that you'll be able to kind of improve the way that your users sort of experience their interactions with you, and actually looking at some of the things on the screen now, you know, thinking about how you can shape the user experience, or really considering that purpose of the interaction and why users interact with you, what they're looking for. Perhaps we can help you further understand, you know, who your users actually are, what their points of engagement are, their points of touch, their touch points along the way. We're going to have a look at how personas and user journey mappings can further benefit perhaps your services and the products, and not just actually along those digital projects, but perhaps strategy as well, or other types of projects. By doing the approaches, are there opportunities for streamlining and efficiencies around staff, around queries coming in, and then finally services and products. So are there any gaps that we can identify, or any new opportunities there? So we're going to have a look at personas first. So let me just move on the slide. So personas, it's all around seeing the world through the eyes of others, which enables you to gain that insight and make decisions based on their actual needs. And we're not just thinking about the broad stakeholder type here, so, you know, a member, a donor, a major funder or supporter. It's also about their kind of personal preferences, their capabilities, their needs and emotions. And by considering all of that together, that's what really makes this work valuable. So we've put on the slide a little bit of a definition for you. So they are their fictional representations of your users. Fictional, yet believable. So that's quite a critical thing to remember. You know, they've got to be believable characters so that you can really, you know, really then base the mapping and services on their actual needs, and you're putting yourself in their footsteps, really. So based on that very quick kind of overview of a definition, I am going to hand over to Michael.
Thank you. Let's have a little look at what would make up a persona. So going from left to right, you can pick initially. I think it's really important to pick the type of stakeholder that you're thinking about. So we've got some examples here: members of a profession, stakeholders, policymakers. But very much depends on the sector you're in and the type of organization you are. And there's some other ideas here, such as service users, volunteers, donors, and so on. Actually, you might also think about personas sometimes if you're doing an exercise for staff who are within an organization, and you might want to do an exercise where you split up and think about new joiners or people that have been there a while, and think about various pathways for your staff within the organization. So very much something that is commonly used with that external view, but you can even use it internally. To make them believable, this is that point Rebecca just made, really important. So they need a bit of character, and a really good way to do that, give them a name and give them a face, so that they start to become somebody that you can refer to, and you get to know that person and their needs and behaviors, which moves us on really to the last column on this slide. So we've got a persona, we've given them a name, and then we need to think about, right, what are they trying to achieve? And that's the kind of key thing behind all of this. Personas are all about empathy. So it allows us, we've got a day job, we're working for an organization, and we're really thinking about how to get the stuff done that, you know, the objectives we've been set by our managers or what have you. And rather than just make a simple change to the site, the persona approach allows us to go, right, what am I doing with this piece of information, for example? Am I thinking about it from the perspective of the person who really needs it? Because it might be somebody who, you might have a persona, a quick example, you might have a persona that is somebody called Bob, who doesn't know anything about your organization at all. Complete newcomer. So they don't really know what you stand for, they don't know how you're organized, they don't know whether you're even valid for them. So if you're doing a piece of work and it's important for your new joiners type of journey experience, that allows you to really just put your mind into how Bob is thinking and make sure the piece of work you're doing is suitable and helps Bob. So if we step if we step forwards, we can start to have a look at some of the examples that we've got next.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Really interesting. And before we do that, I just actually had a question about
Sure.
actually getting started. So yeah, we've thought about all of this, kind of what's next, and then yeah, absolutely, let's go through some examples.
Sure. Okay. So getting started, it's how do you decide what kind of personas you might approach, and that's about looking at the information that you have to hand. So if you're running the site, you've got some analytic data maybe on that, and that can help you with things like the sort of demographics, maybe the interests, maybe some of the behaviors. But look beyond the analytics. Sometimes that data can be quite dry, and you should probably within your organization have other information. Maybe you do surveys of how your users, your constituents, customers, whatever you call them. You may well have some surveys going on about how they're experiencing your services, and there'll be some useful information there. You can go a bit further and pull together some willing volunteers. Quite often in the sectors we work with, there are lots of people who are very willing to help from outside an organization. So you run some interviews and get to explore what type of person they are and what their needs and behavior is. And also don't overlook the rest of your organization, your colleagues. So if you've got a sort of like customer support, member support team, maybe a help desk, very often they have brilliant insight in terms of, for example, some of the challenges that your constituents might be facing. And so that will really help you start to sense about the groupings, because you can see from that kind of information, the sort of from across the vast panoply of different users and members and donors and what have you who are coming in. And it gives you that basis on which to start deciding, right, now we're going to chunk these up and have personas that represent the different groupings.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know that we've got some questions later on just to delve into that a little bit more about how to get started and things. And thank you, we've got some questions already coming in, so that's great, keep them coming along. So moving on to some examples then, Michael, actually.
Great, so thank you. We've got 4 examples here, and just to sort of run through them from left to right, there's one called Ryan. This is a university who put together a range of different personas. So there you can see the specific Ryan. He's a current undergraduate. So one of the main constituents of a university. There are lots of undergraduates at the majority of universities, but there would have been other personas such as school leavers who are thinking about where to go next and making a decision about which university to go to. And also for universities, there would have been personas like the alumni group, for example, quite an important group. You'd also have had things like lecturers maybe and researchers. They may have been put together as one persona, or they may have been done separately. Going sort of clockwise around, if we jump up to the top right, there's one there called Nancy, and this is a Transport for London persona. And you can see quite a lot of information here, and it's quite a nice kind of graphical layout. Easy to absorb that information if you're looking at it for the first time. And you can start to see the kinds of information they're pulling together. So Nancy is a newbie visitor, doesn't know London. And you can see there's information there about Nancy and then about what she needs, what she's going to do in terms of planning her journeys and so forth. And they've got a quite nice little kind of scale in the bottom left-hand corner of that gives a sense of her confidence and her tendency to plan and so on. So really nicely laid out. But if we move round again clockwise to Elizabeth in the bottom right-hand corner, I wanted to show that one because it's a much simpler layout and very easy thing to produce. So you don't need to have really sort of professional and highly polished pieces of work here. They can be incredibly simple, which anyone can do without necessarily having sort of rich graphic design type skills. And then in the middle, where we've got those 3 sort of pinned onto that wire mesh, Ashley and Ron and the other name I can't quite see. These are from the Gov UK's one of the Gov UK's digital teams, And I'm showing this example because I think it's one of the really, really useful things about the persona exercise. Once you've done the research and pulled together that whole set of personas, make them as some kind of sort of asset or artifact that you can print out and stick on the wall, or pin to a whiteboard or whatever it might be. But put them into the open, because it encourages conversations, and that's one of the absolute of this whole webinar today. I think one of the biggest benefits is when you start having those conversations between colleagues, between teams, and being able to pin something like this on the wall is an absolutely fantastic conversation starter. And if you're doing good things with personas, it'll help you spread that good sort of the benefits that are coming from that good piece of work around the organization more widely. So shall we move on to the next slide? Thank you very much. So I'm reiterating that point. I think it's a great kind of real world example we've just seen. You'll have them digitally, but that physical point, really important. Get them printed out and stuck on the wall. Then in terms of how we use them, well, we'll move on to this shortly within the webinar, but it's vital when you're putting together a user journey map that you're thinking about who that user is, who's on that journey, and that's where the personas come in. So you'll see an example in a minute where we've used the persona in that journey map. So those two go together. Really important that they're thought of as a pair. And then finally on this point, refer to them. So planning activities, interactions, website content. Had an example of this just last week with a client that we're working through and trying to figure out how best to represent information for the different personas that we've planned for this website project. And we were looking at some detail around perhaps a non-core group, the persona group. So there's not a huge number of people within this group, but they're really quite important because it's the sort of the press, the media, policymakers, influencers, that kind of group. It allowed us to have some really useful conversations about what are their needs, how do they find their information, when they're presented with the new site design that we're working on, are they going to be able to find the information they need? And it allowed us to, again, take that empathetic approach and be really sort of think about what's their day job like. They're incredibly busy, they're very rushed, they need to be able to get straight to the important information for them. And we feed that then into the conversations we're having about how to organize that particular website for that client. So bringing those in allows everyone around the table to talk about the problem from the same perspective, and it allows us to stop thinking about it such as what we think ourselves. In that conversation, nobody around the table was saying, I don't like the way that works. They were talking about, I think, let's call them Bob again as a persona, I don't think Bob would find that helpful. And it's a much clearer way to think through some of these problems and challenges.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's move on to sort of the second approach, but obviously they're very closely linked. So user journey maps. So, whether you're looking to fix website problems, you're looking to improve your overall digital experience for your users, journey maps are a great way of doing this. And there are no specific rules or to how the map should be created, how it should look. So it means you can have, there can be very different approaches and looks to all of these. But the main thing is it's a visual representation which illustrates the steps that the user takes to complete a task or a goal. There's lots of opportunities we can get, from doing this. And we've just listed a few there. So you might be looking to do this because you're going through, a new website design. You're trying to think about, the steps and the journeys that your user takes. Perhaps you're digitizing an existing service. We struggle with that word. Perhaps you're looking at improving an existing service, or actually looking at the source of where customer frustrations or complaints come in. So how can you actually mitigate against those? And again, looking at new opportunities. So it's really going through kind of the steps people take to accomplish a goal or a task. And it's, in its most basic form, it could be a bit of user actions in a timeline, but really, you know, we're going to look at how it can be fleshed out with those user thoughts and emotions as well to kind of create more of a narrative. So I'm going to hand back to Michael again to look at getting started.
Thank you. So first thing to know, once you've decided you need a map, there are no specific rules on what it looks like. You can do some searching on the internet about user experience journey maps. It's quite a good phrase to use. You will see all sorts of different maps out there, all sorts of different styles. Some of the most effective I've seen have been scribbled with whiteboard markers, you know, and they look very messy, but they've been done collectively, and they've been incredibly powerful in terms of allowing that group of people to gain a better understanding. So no rules at all about what they look like. And don't get necessarily stuck in one particular channel. I gave an example earlier about a website, and it may be that it's appropriate to just think about a journey through a website. Fine, if that's what you need. But it could also be useful actually to step back slightly from that and to think about something from a multi-channel perspective. So there, you know, it may be that somebody starts off in a browser doing a search on Google. They're not even anywhere near your organization at this point. They're using a search engine. They find some information, but then they move to a phone because they want to call up and have a conversation with somebody. And then they might step from that, having learned a bit more, back into web. So the multi-channel aspect, you know, in that example, we've gone from a search engine to your website, to the phone, back to the website. And it's not necessarily something that's happening in one session, if you like, either. So, you know, some things like e-commerce, we might start, do some searching, pick a product, buy, and it all completes within a number of minutes. But your map might span days or weeks or months. It doesn't have any restrictions to it. When you're mapping it out, very straightforward. Just think about those steps that the users go through and make sure that the first step really is the first step. Just gave an example previously about a user on your website, but their first step may well have been on the search engine before your website. So that's maybe the first step, even maybe a step before that. You know, they had a word of mouth recommendation. So just think about those steps and make sure you've gone back far enough and that you go forwards far enough. And once we start to do that, I think we can go into this a bit more detail on the next slide in terms of emotions. That's one of the things that's really useful. There are going to be good things, i.e. things that are working well, and you might be able to sort of sit back on your laurels at that point and go, well, we've got that one sorted. There will typically be some areas that you think are bad or poor and can be improved. But actually, even on the good, things can always be made even better. So it's well worth thinking about the good and the bad and opportunities in both. So some ideas here for you in terms of getting that map together. So you can come at it from the perspective of scenarios and a particular task. I think one of the first times I was introduced to a user experience journey map, the scenario, it's a really interesting one. It was about a young girl who had a medical condition and had to be booked into hospital to have an MRI. And it was a fantastic map that looked at this right from the beginning when their doctor or GP had made that recommendation. So then they had to start talking to a specialist and make an appointment and make a trip to go, and the MRI was in a particular hospital, so they had to make a special trip. You know, it was a really interesting scenario, and it went through quite a number of weeks, and the emotions on that one, moving around to the right, the emotions on that one were going high and low, you know, and this little girl, there were times when she was quite sort of fearful and scared of what was about to happen. It was a great opportunity to be able to think, how can we deal with that emotion at that time and turn it around into something that, you know, she feels more excited about. And I won't go into all the detail, but they came up with some really great ways of changing how they handled it. That was the opportunities that they found. So think about the actions, and the good thing with actions is that you can think, what's the user doing, which might be demonstrated at one level in the map, but then you can also think, right, well, what does that mean for our organization? So we've got maybe some back office teams that are needing to respond to that user at that point because of what they've done? And are those teams doing that the best way they can? Do they have enough information to actually make it, make what they do work really well? And so you're going to find opportunities for improvement, not just at the front end, but also, within your back end, back office sort of operations as well. And I think we've talked a bit about users as well. So yes, let's have a look at a specific example. This is a fictitious example, but there you go, top right, you've got the persona, and we would put the person's name there, the face that we're using. We saw those examples earlier on, so we'd have a kind of précis of that. Just to remind us that I'm going to keep using Bob as my persona example, but let's imagine we've got Bob, and we just say here what Bob is trying to achieve in a very brief sentence or two. We've got layers, if you like, in this map. So at the top, quite straightforward in terms of the actions they're going through, and the example we put together here was a prospective member. So this is for a membership organization, and there's somebody who's thinking about joining. And we've got those steps there. So they've gone from awareness, they sort of know your organization, then they're considering joining, then there's a decision point, which follows with an action. And in this particular example, we're looking at something where it didn't complete, if you like. So they ended up not joining. And that's a great example, it's sort of perhaps focusing on a negative, but if we can understand what happened here and make some changes, we'll reduce those lost opportunities. It's an obvious thing to explore. Second row down, you've got the user actions, and I won't go into that, you can read those details. Third row down, we've got the emotions, and we're using a bit of a chart there. So you can see from when it's working well, and then there's the dip as you get to that fourth stage. They need the pricing, they couldn't find it, and there was a sort of disillusionment at that point, and then it became a lost opportunity. So at the bottom, we've got where the opportunities are to make some improvements. Now, before we move on, I mean, it's done very simply, but let's imagine that this has been done by a group. I think that's quite an important thing. Those opportunities at the bottom shouldn't really just come from one person. If we can put together journey maps as a collective with people from different teams, then that's how you find out the best opportunities to follow, because you can bring in people with knowledge of sort of different corners of your organization, and you can find simple wins quite often that a great thing to find, because they're really easy to make that change and start changing things for the better.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, quick question before we move on, Michael. So obviously we've talked that they can take different forms in terms of how they're designed and how they look. So if someone from an organization is attempting to do this, they're running the workshops, they're getting in that information, to then come up with the design of the journey map, is there a specific software, or does someone need to be a graphic designer, or what advice have you got?
Absolutely. Well, certainly you don't need to be a graphic designer, and you don't have to use specific software. So if we just follow this example, if this was done collaboratively, it might initially, the first sort of draft of it, if you like, might well have been done on a whiteboard or a flip chart or something like that. Then if you want to follow this up and actually make it something that you can sort of use and share, it is useful to be able to produce a slightly sort of neater version than a scribbly, than a photo of a scribbly whiteboard. This one was put together using PowerPoint. Now that's not, a professional graphic tool, but the great example, a great advantage, sorry, of something like PowerPoint is, the reason I picked PowerPoint is if you're a Microsoft organization, then everyone in your organization typically is going to have PowerPoint, and that's a fantastic thing, because then this can be a collective piece that anyone can produce and anyone can edit. And you might have colleagues who sort of riff on this and change, take away your wording, but use it as a template for an exercise they're going to do. So it sort of democratizes the whole approach, and it takes it, it stops it being sort of locked up in specialist software from a graphic designer. So I'm a great advocate of something like PowerPoint, because I think it brings lots of people in. But also there are other ways of doing it which are free and quite easy to use. and quite good in a kind of collaborative sense if you're doing this kind of thing online. So some of the whiteboard services that you get now, like Mural, for example, is one I was using a couple of days ago. They come with lots of pre-built templates that you can use, and Mural, I know, has a couple of journey map templates that not necessarily the way to do it, but you can have a look at that, get examples from it, and if you're doing it in an online environment, then that might be a tool to look at. Brilliant,
thanks so much, Michael. And we'll just move on to sort of final slide from you, I think. We'll move on to some questions.
Sure. So what we've got here is kind of looking, right, we've done personas. That was quick. We're at 10 o'clock and we've sorted that, and journey maps. How are you then using them in the digital projects? So at different stages, they can come in handy, and I keep coming back to them actually on the projects I work on. So let's say initially, if you're dealing with a tech partner, if you've done these yourself, then it's a really useful tool to get your technology partners up to speed with the things that make your organization different. Hopefully you've got a tech partner with lots of experience of other organizations, but it's a great way to have a discovery session. If you don't have them in place, then very often in the sort of digital sphere, tech partners will be offering this as part of their proposal or as one of the services they offer. And if that's a possibility, then it's a great route to take. As I said, ongoing comms, keep them on hand, print them out. I'm going to keep repeating that one: print them out and stick them on the wall, and keep them visible, because it whenever you're facing a knotty challenge, I find turning to these as a way to solve them can be fantastically useful. And it doesn't matter at what level of the organization either. So, if you've got the CEO walking past, this kind of thing is a really quick way to get to the root of an issue. We have, senior people tend not to have huge amounts of time, but you can tell a huge story with a picture really quickly. So it can be a great way to communicate what you're doing. Strategic alignment. I mean, you can use it, I think, well in things like if you've got a board of trustees or something like that, then it's a really good way to be explaining what you're doing and how you're trying to make things better. Implementation. I've given an example of that already, but believe me, it was a really great way to allow a group of people to just put their own views and opinions to one side and collectively really work on what the personas need. It makes a huge difference. And then finally, on KPIs, I strongly believe that these can be used with a sort of KPI approach. Quite often, I think in an organization, we can look at KPIs and think that's all about data. And in a digital scenario like with a website, we might then think from data and go to analytics. And often analytics will give you data, but it's not telling you specifically about outcomes. The great thing about a persona and a journey map is that it's really outcome based. And if you want to tie your KPIs into outcomes, then try going a little bit beyond the analytics and into something like a story, because that's where you get real outcomes for real people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. I love the idea of that, telling that story as well. I think it's just really brings to life some of the projects, hopefully people are working on. So I'm just going to move on the slide, and lots of insight already, lots of good questions coming in. So before we answer some of those questions, Michael, we're just going to delve into a little bit more with you first. So I think it's so interesting, the knowledge you've got and the expertise. So actually, I think it'd be really interesting for the audience out there just to perhaps know a little bit more about sort of yourself and your background.
Sure. Okay. So I started, although I've said you don't need to be a graphic designer, I have to admit I did start out in life as a graphic designer. So that was my start, and that was fundamentally about visual communications. And I think that comes back to the storytelling aspect here. So that's why it's particularly appealed to me, this sort of user journey approach. I started off doing graphic design in a print-based world because it was actually so long ago that it was before the web was a thing. But then that quickly came on very early in my career, and the visual communication skills that I had transferred across, and I started doing work within the web world, which after a while became more known as the digital world. Then I had a fairly good stint at the Wellcome Trust, so a large research and donor-giving charity, very large charity. And after that, I moved into higher education, and I worked for a couple of different universities there. And then I came and joined Hart Square.
Perfect, thank you. And obviously you said about, you know, that sort of whole starting off as a graphic designer, but really interested in that visual representation of things. So is that where kind of your interest or sort of passion for this kind of area came from, do you think? And
yeah, absolutely. It's I find it really fascinating in discussions and meetings how often people say, I'm a visual communicator. And yet so often our day-to-day life is emails full of words, Word document full of words, even PowerPoint slides full of words. So a lot of us, I think, really are visual communicators, but the tools we use tend not to be so visual, they tend to be more words. And this is a way to get back to the visual aspect of it. And it's powerful, and it can be more powerful than words. So telling those stories through pictures, which is what we're talking about here, and bringing people together to construct those pictures is, it's powerful. And that's why I find it really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And we sort of saw from the poll results right at the start of the kind of the session that quite a lot of people were, you know, trying to find that insight or getting started. So when you've worked with challenges or when you've worked with clients, or perhaps actually, you know, when you've done this yourself, what have been some of the biggest challenges you face when people are starting off this piece of work?
When we're starting the work, sometimes well, first of all, it can be difficult to know where to start. So that depends a little bit on how you're doing it. If you've got a tech partner helping you, then, you know, you can take the lead from them and they would be able to guide you through the process. If you're doing it yourself, we've touched on some of the ways earlier of first of all, start with the personas and think about the groupings and put those together. Classically, you know, if you're doing it for the first time, don't expect to get it right first time, but just start, because it's one of those pieces where as soon as you start doing it, it builds a bit of momentum of its own. I think when it comes to that sort of persona, so when it comes to maps, it can feel a bit daunting, you know, what do I start mapping? And what I do there is think about, just listen out for where people are talking about where they think there are problems for your users. And as soon as you hear a problem being described, that could be a good place to try starting. So again, start somewhere, don't expect to get it right first time, but as soon as you start and are able to, like we talked about with the maps, you know, build them out by layers and by steps, you will start to discover things. And in a way, maybe that's why they're called maps, you know, because it's about exploring issues, and you need a map to do that.
Absolutely, I really like that, and I really like actually that when you think about what they're called, it's a journey or a path, isn't it? Actually, and you don't know which way they're going to take you, and it's a little bit like kind of conducting these, I think. So I think you sort of just mentioned there about kind of the order in which you do things. So is it, you know, would you do personas first and complete that activity before you move on to journey maps, or would you start doing personas and then kind of collaboratively work in journey mapping? Kind of how do they work together, or what's your best advice?
You can do it either way around. I think it's if it's a sort of 40-60 split, maybe, with going with personas first. If you can get the personas sorted out first, because then you know who the character is who's exploring that map that we talked about. If you can't do that first, and it's not always possible, do the map, but try and think about at least sort of characterizing who the map is about. And it might not be a fully fledged persona, but you can at least say, well, I'm thinking here about, like the example we showed, you know, a prospective member or a prospective donor or whoever it may be. Give them at least something, you know, because whoever they are, they're at some point, and you can characterize that in a few words. So if you can't do a fully fledged persona before you start the map, at least put something in about who's on the map.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've kind of talked a little bit earlier about how kind of personas and journey maps kind of fit into that sort of life cycle of a digital project. But have you any thoughts or an experience on how it can be used to more inform sort of an organization's strategy or other types of projects that, you know, might not be just web or digital, for example?
I think, one good example is how they can be used to help make the case for some investment. So if you're putting some kind of case forward, whether it's kind of quite high level business case for serious levels of investment in terms of cost and time, or, you know, even at simpler levels, then I think it's a great way to show that you've done some analysis. You know, you've really looked at this in detail, and you can see across this whole map we're talking about where there are some opportunities to improve things, and you can identify quick fixes, and you could even say, look, we've done quick fixes, we've made some incremental changes, but there's a clear dip here which is the result of, I don't know, XYZ going wrong, and make the case for investment in that, because, you know, it's a great sort of analysis tool to show to those who you might need to persuade to let you do something.
Absolutely. So thinking about, you know, if you're that person and you've got to persuade someone else, what kind of role or, you know, what specific skills would someone need to lead this piece of work? Because it strikes me there's probably quite a lot of our delegates that have joined us today from kind of broad, you know, job titles, different types of departments. So is there a typical role to do this, or who should lead it? What skills do they need?
Yeah, I'd be quite ambivalent. I don't think it sort of belongs just in one area and one team, because actually it is about bringing teams together very often. So it could be in web, it could be in marketing, it could be in sort of customer or user support, or you know, whatever. Different, you know, what I've picked there are teams with different skills who either have sort of skills in terms of production or have skills in terms of listening to users. And I think it can sit across all of those. In terms of where would be best, it would be, what you sort of really need to make it work well is somebody or a team who can do the facilitation, who can really encourage collaboration, get people who you don't know into the room doing it with you, because it breaks down barriers fantastically. And also somebody who's got the ability to sort of do a bit of prep and planning, execute the actual creation of these things. And then I think you want some follow through. And for me, the follow through is really important. As I said, when you get people together, it can be quite a motivating thing to be able to analyze things in this way. And so, you know, you've got a whole group of staff now who may well be quite motivated. So the follow through is really important, because you want to keep that spirit going.
Brilliant. And actually talking about people, so leads me quite nicely on to the next question. We've kind of talked a little bit about tools, software, how to actually create them. But in terms of kind of bringing people together then, any advice for kind of formats of workshops, or how to kind of, you know, get those thoughts and ideas from people, whether it's team-based or cross departments?
I'd always go for cross departments, cross teams, if you can. And it's one of the areas I've seen it work really well is with away days, and it's a great sort of exercise to put together, especially maybe after lunch, because you get people up and thinking and walking around, and you use all the classic kind of facilitation tools, you know, so you'll have a big whiteboard or lots of flip charts and post-it notes and marker pens and what have you, it's one of those things where if you've got maybe like a slightly broader away day where you've got lots of different members of the organization, this can bring them together to sort of look at problems and challenges. And I really enjoy the way that people who just because they're in busy jobs don't normally get to talk to each other can at that point start talking, and you see some incredible insights being shared. You know, they might well have worked together for a number of years. I've seen it where people that have, you know, have been in the same organization for a fair few years have for the first time had that kind of conversation with another colleague, and you can see sort of moments of revelation. So it's a really fantastic thing to do in an away day, and as I said, it can be really quite motivational as well.
I love that idea, and team away day. I'm sure there are people out there thinking whether that's going to be an option for them going forward. So yeah, we've still got lots of questions coming in, and I'm conscious of time, so we'll wrap this up shortly and then move on to answer some of those questions that have come in. Michael, so if you had 3 key benefits to organisations considering doing personas and journey maps, what would those be? I don't know whether you can whittle them down to 3.
I sort of tried to think about 3, and I think the empathy and the focus on your users. So it's a tool that can really make you look at the world through their eyes, you know, walk in their shoes, that kind of thing. That's number 1. We've just touched on the second one, bringing teams together and getting that shared focus. I think, you know, I'm sure all your teams are already thinking, oh, we know what we're doing, and of course we're shared and focused on the users. But trust me, you bring them together and you get some real insights and some much more clarity, and you can get even better at what you're doing by just bringing the teams together with this kind of exercise. And then finally, we have touched on it briefly, but again, it's a great example of being able to find some areas that aren't quite right for users, and it's a quick fix. You know, really, some of the opportunities for improvement are really easy to do. You sort of don't need to go away and create a vast project to change the world. It's stuff that you can sort of, you know, do the following day, and you can change a few things and start making things better. So you can get those quick fixes, and at the same time identify where you might need to want to sort of invest a bit more time and energy and money. So finding, you know, the best place to put your attention to improve the things you do.
Absolutely brilliant. So I did have one final question around top tips, but I think we'll come back to that one just as a closer. Sure. Lots of questions coming in, so let me just work through a few of them. So we had someone who just wanted to double check about it being recorded. So yeah, just to confirm, yep, session's being recorded, and I will send that out later on this afternoon along with a copy of the slides. That's that question. So quite a lot of questions are coming around personas actually, so we'll see if we can go through some of those. Someone's asked if you had a view on whether to include photos of real people or not in the personas. So is there a risk that that could introduce elements of unconscious bias?
Well, I think there's 2 questions there. So yes, there can most definitely be unconscious bias, and I would encourage people. I don't think personally using pictures of real people is right, because well, obviously you need their permission. I mean, maybe the culture of your organization, it's something that would work, you know, and if you can see it as a very positive thing, then go for it. But by default, I would err towards using something from stock imagery, or we saw in the examples actually, sometimes they're sort of cartoon type approaches are used. And in a sense, I think most of the time, you want to be able to think about things from the persona's perspective, but you want it slightly abstract, because very often a persona is representing quite a wide group of people. And that's where we come back to the unconscious bias. So you might want to think about using a persona who has, for example, some accessibility issues. But accessibility, sometimes, you know, you can see if somebody might have an accessibility issue, and sometimes you can't. And so I think it's quite a good thing to challenge yourself slightly when you're putting the photos on, and don't go for the obvious ones. Challenge your own biases, and you know, get other people to check them too, because it's a really good question. I have seen personas that have basically got some bias built into them, and I've challenged back and said, for example, you know, if we've got one where you might have somebody in a very sort of senior position, should it be someone who looks a bit like me, you know, male and of a certain age and with hair that's going a bit grey? Well, maybe not actually. Let's challenge that bias, and others as well.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So moving on to more persona questions. Is there an ideal number of personas an organisation should look to create? Because I'm guessing, you know, it's always that balance of having enough but not having too many, I'm guessing. But I don't know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think there is. I think you can have too many, and there are downsides to that. It takes a longer time to produce, and then when you're trying to use them in those problem-solving situations, you don't want to be sort of looking at your, let's say you've done the good thing of printing them out and you've got them on the wall and you've got 25. It can be hard just to pick up the one you need to think about. So you want a small, easily manageable number, and something like 6 or 7 is a good thing to try and aim for. And that falls into, I don't know what the actual word's called, but there's an element of thinking that comes in with things like navigation and web design, where menus in web design, I'll get back to the number here. Menus in web design shouldn't have too many items in them, because then it makes it harder to choose. And so there's an ideal number there of 6, 7, 8, something like that. And I think the same thing comes here. So you want it to be like the amount of people who'd fit around a table. You want to be able to remember all their names. And if you go above that kind of number, you know, if you've got 9 or 10 or 12, it starts to become just difficult to manage. So I'd say somewhere in the region of 6 or 7, plus or minus 1 or 2.
Brilliant, thank you. And then kind of related to that, so for each of the personas, we've got a question that's come in that says sort of the list of sort of requirements or elements that you could kind of cover about each persona seems quite never ending. So, you know, in terms of name, type, emotions. So when you're thinking about those questions that you want to kind of almost ask yourself when you're putting together each persona, you know, is there a recommended number of elements to include, or what's the most important information to capture? You know, those questions that you should ask yourself.
I think I'd start with 3. So you want to have some that characterize the persona, and you know, I've used Bob quite frequently. You know, the name, and just enough to sort of give the persona enough of a sort of real world character if you can. So that's number 1. Number 2 is you then want to have a bit of understanding of how they, what makes each persona different in terms of your organization. So, you know, in the example we looked at from a university, are they somebody who knows the university really well, or they don't know the university very well at all because they haven't started yet? So that's the second area. You know, you need to be able to define the differences between the personas so that you can pick a persona and do some thinking with them. And then the third area is their needs. So you just need to think about, right, so we know Bob is a prospective student at the university. What are their needs? So that allows you then to go through, well, you know, if they're thinking about going to university, they're probably having to think about what subject to choose, which part of the country, or even which country to go to, where to live, how to finance it, what's going to be on their course. And you know, so the needs then also allow you to start thinking about, are we serving those needs?
Brilliant. And we've talked, another persona question, by the way, we've talked about, you know, the importance of making them visual and, you know, the benefits and why we should be doing that. Someone's asked, should a persona fit on one page? So it's quite a kind of, you know, practical question. You talked about sort of hanging them up or having them available to view.
Yes, yes, they should fit on one page. Absolutely. I mean, I would say if they're going beyond one page, then you might be spending more time in the exercise of defining the persona than you are in where the main game is. So here the main point is to use the persona to solve some of the problems or challenges that, you know, you might be facing in the organization. So the exercise of keeping it to one page, I think, is important. As I said, don't have 20 or 30 because it will take you too long, and don't have more than one page because it'll take you too long. It becomes an industry in its own right, and you can't print it out and stick it on the wall. Yeah, absolutely. And we've got lots of questions. Some of them we have actually kind of already answered through the discussion, but I'd ask, you know, if anyone has anything they want to ask about the session at all, then please follow up afterwards when I send out the information. We're really happy to answer any more questions you've got, because I am conscious we're kind of coming towards the end. So
I'm going to sort of throw in a couple of just closing questions, I think, Michael. So someone's asked, have you ever sort of encountered any problems getting buy-in from SMT or sort of your senior managers about allocating resources and time to do this?
I think, yes, you can. Is it just looking like something to, that is not real work because it's not lots of words on a page, it's pictures. So if you're facing that kind of challenge, do something quite quick, quite informal, look for some quick fixes, get some small wins where you can achieve that without permission. And then you can show some success, and classic kind of show some wins and ask for forgiveness afterwards. The other route is with the the away day exercise. Quite often, having ideas put forward for that can be really helpful for senior management. So you could also sort of propose, look, we did this thing, it was really quick and easy, it only took a couple of hours one afternoon, if you've done a real boiled down version, but you can then advocate for that to be used in a wider version.
Brilliant. And I'm curious to know, actually, we've talked lots about benefits and how to do this or why. Are there any mistakes you can make with doing personas or journey mapping?
Well, we've covered some of them, I suppose, in some of the some of the questions. I think the one about bias is a really good question, and I as I say, I've seen mistakes made there, and it's worth challenging that, and maybe that leads to other questions about, well, why is that unconscious bias present? Do we need to do some organizational work about that? I think mistakes. I mean, in a way, what we talked about with personas being more than one page and becoming an industry, the same thing could happen with a map. You could really get into the idea of, we could add an extra layer to show the difference between this part of the organization and that part of the organization. You can end up with this, many layered sort of cake. And there might be benefit in that, but the more you go into that, the more complicated your analysis is becoming. And these really are about trying to simplify a worldview. So they are about analysis, but at the same time, keep it relatively simple, keep moving, because fundamentally the output is not the persona or the map. What you're seeking are ways to improve your organization and improve the experience your users get. So you want to move through doing personas and maps to fixing things and improving things. And if you're not actually getting to that point because you're spending too long on the map, then I think that would be a mistake.
Perfect. And one last thing before we close. So what's your top tip for anyone who's thinking about going away from today's session and getting started with this?
My top tip would be, if you're doing it for the first time, then find a friend, find a little bit of time and do a practice session. Because it will just be incredibly useful just to sort of run through it. You'll understand the kind of timings you need if you're going to run a session with a team. You'll understand how many bits of flip chart paper you might need to stitch together. What kind do you need? Colored pens? Are you going to bring a bit of string in because you can hang the string? Do a practice session with somebody first, and it will give you lots of insight in how to run it in a wider group after that.
I love that. Thank you so much, Michael, for all of that insight today. And I hope for everyone who's joined today, it just gives you that little bit more of information, little nuggets of information that you can go away and you can get started. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. And
thank you all.
Thank you to you, Michael, as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Bye.